this episode of What Could Go Right, I'm speaking with Alissa Quart. The proximate reason for this conversation is her recently published book, Squeezed: Why Our Families Can't Afford America. But Alissa has been charting fascinating stories of individual lives and individual struggles for many years. She is the author of 4 previous books, one called Branded, about our advertising culture, Republic of Outsiders, about people who, as the title suggests, are not fully integrated into what we call a norm, but have their own fascinating stories, Hothouse Kids, and Monetize, which is a volume of poetry. She writes a bi-monthly column for The Guardian, and she is also now executive editor of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which is a journalism nonprofit that is founded and run by her and Barbara Ehrenreich. She was a 2010 Nieman Fellow at Harvard, has been nominated for an Emmy and a National Magazine Award. And she takes a hard look at what's going on in our world today and stories of people who are manifestly struggling to either stay within what we call the middle class. She calls a group the precariat, those who are really on the fringe and trying to stay on that fringe and not fall back. And she has, I think, an unusual way of telling people's stories and finding them. She has tracked many of the people in this book for many years. And while her overall conclusions do not suggest that a whole lot is going right with the American dream these days, I think telling those stories and having an engaged conversation about that is part of the necessary mix. And I'm looking forward to hearing her thoughts. Here talking with Alissa Quart, who has this brilliant new book, Squeezed: Why Our Families Can't Afford America, based on some intensive reportage and stories across the United States of individuals and families who are feeling no longer able to maintain a position within what used to be, as Alissa says, a very stable middle class. And I've known Alissa for a long time and watched her career and watched what she's written with fascination and admiration simultaneously. So this is a fascinating book, Alissa, and I think also comes a little bit out of your own personal experiences, right, about what you started confronting, you and your husband started confronting, having a child in an incredibly difficult, challenging, expensive New York City. But you then went around and started talking to a lot of other people to see where those experiences were shared and what else was going on. So if you could, in your elevator pitch way, just tell me a little bit about what you learned, what you saw, what you were looking for.
So when I went around the country and called around the country and emailed around the country, I was basically trying to take the temperature of what politicians were referring to as the middle class. You know, why was it was a useful category politically, it seemed, and even by companies like Uber, that like to talk about their middle-class drivers, but not so much for actual middle-class people. So I wanted to see what the experience was on the ground. And I wound up talking to adjunct professors and lawyers who were out of work and nurses who were afraid their jobs were going to robots, just a whole range of people kind of on the edge. And then because I follow people for years, and this book started 5 years ago, I started reporting it, things happen to the people, and some of them are good. So, you know, it's not all a bleak story. Maybe this is part of your podcast theme, that our expectations get overturned, but they didn't get overturned in a foundational way. It was characterological, like people would figure out how to live differently, marginally differently, and have a somewhat better life by the end, some of the people.
Were you surprised by anything? I mean, so you started this 4 years ago. When you started, what was your theme? Was it exactly this? Was it a little bit other than this? What was it?
It was this, and one thing that surprised people was I wanted to include people who were peering into the middle class and wanted to get in but weren't there traditionally, like care workers or, night nurses or, people who were doing just-in-time labor, for Home Depot or working strange shifts. And I wanted to include these people as a piece of this broader book on the middle class because I felt like a lot of the books for middle-class parents just delete those caregivers and the whole apparatus that is like a nesting doll that is supporting the struggling middle class. So there are two kinds of struggle going on in this. That was an effort to connect these two things for publishers too, in the publishers' minds. But I'm glad I did, because I feel like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's victory in New York and Queens has sort of shown the use value of connecting the working class precariat and what I call the middle precariat, or uncomfortable, struggling middle class with a uncomfortable, struggling working class conceptually, like that there's a value to bringing these two constituencies together.
But are they really different constituencies, or are they just different ways of self-identifying?
Well, I think they're both. I think some of the middle class people in my book came from working class or lower middle class backgrounds, and I guess this is part of why they weren't always able to stabilize or find a net for themselves. You know, when you and I went to grad school, and if we couldn't get a job initially, right, we'd have something from our parents. Some of the people in this book didn't have that, right? So it was like a complicated identity. Like they were trying to become middle class, and they got the training to do it, but it didn't quite work out, and then there was nowhere for them to go for support, right? They couldn't go back to their families. So that might be one story, and that was an identification, a blurry identification. Some of it is just earning power. I mean, the nanny is making considerably less than, say, the IT guy outside San Francisco who still identifies as struggling, even though he makes, low six figures.
Although it's funny, I wrote this book, I realize it's almost 20 years ago, 19 years ago, called What's College For? And there's a whole section there on adjuncts and tenure and the challenge of it. Now, granted, in the greater scheme of things, right, higher education it's a small niche in terms of employment. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of people, but relative to a world of 300 million, it's not a huge one. And that was an issue then, too, of like adjuncts who couldn't make ends meet. I think at the time, as you point out in your chapters on that in Squeezed, you could be an adjunct teaching a full load and make less than the janitorial staff cleaning the classrooms in your community college, because at least the janitorial staff had some sort of local union that allowed them to have something resembling a living wage, whereas the adjuncts didn't. So, I mean, not all this is obviously a new thing, right? I mean, it may have become increasingly acute.
I mean, I went to graduate school in the late 90s, and I put that in the book, and in humanities, and I saw the writing on the wall. And I actually had an interesting conversation with Ron Lieber, a personal finance columnist for the Times, at a book event in Brooklyn recently around Squeezed. And he said, well, didn't any of these people in your book, like the adjuncts, see the writing on the wall? Why did they still go ahead and do this? And I think some of that goes back to class, too, in the sense that not all of them had the kind of cultural capital to be able to read the signs as well as like we might have been able to. They just knew they wanted to get an education. Their advisors were telling them to go ahead and do this, and they were just not reading the tea leaves properly. So I think now it's kind of obvious, like if you still go ahead and become an adjunct, you're entering a very, you're kind of be on the edge. But I think, I don't know, I think even like 15, 20 years ago, not everybody knew that.
I mean, I do wonder whether or not there's a kind of the scales falling away from our eyes, that we are now much more acutely aware, and then you bring these stories to life that makes it impossible not to be acutely aware of the vast swath of society that, given either expectations or needs, is completely unable to find the material sustenance to meet that, right? Mm-hmm. The question is, was that so different 30 years ago, or did we just tell ourselves a story that blinkered us to that reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably told ourselves a story. But I also think, I mean, some of it is like the sheer cost of education, right? So let's say it's doubled in cost since 1996 in public universities. When I went to J school in 97, whatever it was not a huge amount. I can't even remember, but it was not, my family could cover it outright, and they're not wealthy, and now it's like $70,000 or something. So if you're going to get into one of these careers, part of it is how much expense you're going to pay to get a graduate degree and the student debt you're going to be carrying. It is of a different caliber than it was 20 years ago.
Right, and that's certainly true of any elite private university. I went to Columbia. I think tuition wasn't above $10,000 by the time I graduated, and it's 50 plus now, plus another 20 for,
But same with it's double the cost. They did a study; it's double the cost in public universities too.
Right, with less public funding, much less public funding. I mean, this is an interesting question of like, what is the middle class? I mean, is it as an actual category? Is it a self-identification?
Yeah, I feel like it's both. I mean, I always like things that are psychological and existential, and have to do with people's sense of themselves as well as like, you know, whatever the numerical, how it's counted. It's counted, I think, as between 42 and 125,000 a year earning. And but as we know, in San Francisco, they just had this thing that you could be considered lower income with $117,000 a year. So it's very geographically dependent, even when we put a number on it. And then secondly, it is a conceptual category. It's like, how do you think of yourself? Are you, when you say, who am I? Do you say you're middle class? And I think that's interesting too, because I think, if you think about the 60s and 70s, so much of the activity then was, with around the kind of intelligentsia that we came out of, Zach, was, I don't want to be middle class. It's like petit bourgeois. It's humdrum. It's Revolutionary Road. I want to escape its stability and its banality. And now it's like that stability is no longer the cliche around it. Like, and that's a huge shift too. I mean, just as a conceptual, even literary category, a middle class means something different than it did 30 or 40 years ago.
How much of this, and this is a provocative question, meant provocatively, how much of this is that our expectations of what constitutes a baseline of life, how much of that has expanded continually, but our ability to meet that expansion has either contracted or stopped? Meaning, the size of, I've mentioned this number a lot just because it's an easy peg, right? That the size of a Levittown middle-class house in 1950 was 700 or 800 square feet, and the average, even the median for a family in the United States today is 2,100 or 2,200 square feet, and that's even without adding in the kind of absurdity of the McMansions. That's, maybe that's a silly statistic, but it's a question of has our baseline of what we think is acceptable expanded faster than our ability to meet that?
Maybe, but let's think about this here. If you're born in the 40s, and then so you're 30 in 1972, let's say, you're 92%. It was almost assured that you would earn more money than your parents. Now the odds are 50-50 in earning more than your parents, according to a study by the Quality of Opportunity Project. That's different. And so we're not just talking about people living in, giant gated community houses or, they're eating too much avocado toast. One man said that, right, about the millennials. This is why they can't buy houses anymore. But I think the point is they can't afford houses. So maybe they're spending some money on avocado toast, but I don't think that explains it. I think there's a real change in what people have and how much security they have and what kind of future they have to look forward to.
That would have been the Marie Antoinette line of the millennium, right?
Let them eat avocado toast. Yeah. Make sure there's hot pepper flakes on it. Yeah.
So then there's the other question, which I've been and continue to be curious about, and I don't think there's a clear answer, which is, until X being at some point recently, income maximization was exactly the way that you could judge whether or not your life was better, because it allowed you to procure more of your needs and some of your desires. And that remains true, around the world, GDP maximization being a kind of governmental imperative for almost all societies now. But what do you do if many of life's necessities are becoming increasingly less expensive, in which case, in theory, and some of this is truly in theory, you wouldn't need more income, right? If everything you needed to do was having a cost.
Like food or children's toys. I mean, given globalization, some of these things are cheaper, right? Like housing's more expensive. Obviously education is, but there are things that are more one can afford pretty easily, even the struggling middle class. So that makes your point.
But whether or not that's compensatory for the rising costs of healthcare and education.
Yeah, it's not, is it? Because, for instance, like one of the characters in my book, this woman, Michelle, she had a normal birth. Her child was 10 pounds, 13 ounces. It was kind of big, so she had to stay in the hospital an extra day or two. But that was it. She had health insurance, and then she wound up on the hook for $20,000 in hospital debt because her insurance was bad. She's a librarian. She also has a lot of debt for different graduate school programs, so she could train and retrain. So now she's a technological librarian because just being a librarian wasn't really paying off. So she's just kind of typical, but think about that much money. You know, she's got tens of thousands in school debt and then now healthcare debt. There's just no way that having like a cheaper veggie burger at night is going to make that up, you know?
And how did you find people? I mean, how did you find your stories?
I went through unions. I went through nonprofits. I went through web hubs like What's Your Plan B, which is a sort of terrifying Facebook group with 10,000 out-of-work journalists in it. Don't go there. It's very depressing. Yeah. But it's got an immense amount of like talent and good writers and stuff just hanging out there. Yeah, those are the main ways.
And you tried to, I mean, you do go throughout the country in this. It's obviously not just and is there any regional variation, or do you think the experience of in the precariat is more of a national phenomenon that isn't so different whether or not you're in, San Francisco, Denver, Grand Rapids, you name it?
Anecdotally, like I talked to this one graphic artist who was in deep Wisconsin, whose husband was now working at a supermarket chain, even though he had multiple graduate degrees, et cetera. He was working on the floor. And she said that, yes, they have really cheap housing, but now she can't network and get jobs. So they're sort of suffering in a whole other way. So if you are part of this middle precariat that's dependent on certain industries like media or law or academia, arranged, right? How are you going to get those jobs when you're living in a Rust Belt community that is far from industries, like live industries at this point, So that was interesting to me. And I did talk to a number of people like that, actually, who were sort of spread around and in small towns. And that a lot of them were saying that was what they were struggling with.
I mean, there is this whole movement now, because it's a viable question of, what do you do if you're in former Rust Belt parts of Ohio or Western Pennsylvania or upstate New York? What does the economic future hold, and how can you, if you care about your community, try to create one? And there's a whole move by Steve Case and some others to create a kind of a rise of the rest. We should invest more and revitalize those communities. It's obviously too soon to tell whether any of that will work. Did this leave you more negative about the utopian gloss on the gig economy?
Yeah, I was always extremely negative about that. I felt like just on a humane, on the level of the humanity of being a gig worker, I feel like there's a lot of alienation that's just implicit in, not knowing your colleagues and, being on call and never, being a contract worker for life and also, having kind of false promises in terms of places, things like Uber, about how much you can earn. Because a lot of the drivers I spoke to were not earning close to what was promised. And then to be risking being replaced by a robot. It was interesting. One of the conversations was with an organizer who was trying to organize drivers of cars and rideshare cars and truckers against robots. It's kind of like how do you do that? But they were having these phone calls, and each driver would be on their Bluetooth across the country talking about it. So I love that image.
And what is their potential? Is it just we shouldn't license driverless cars? We should restrict? Do they have a sense of what the bulwark would be?
My feeling, and I kept advocate this in the book, is we just need to use restraint and try to slow this process down. And the kind of irrational exuberance around it is going to put a lot of people out of work. And that was the feedback I was getting from drivers when I was speaking to them. They were worried. In addition, things like trucking are a gateway to the middle class for many people. You can earn up to $70,000 being a trucker, and many of these guys are not well educated. Right? This was like nursing is like a portal into the middle class. So I think we have to think carefully before we replace this job. Even if you imagine it's what David Graeber would call a bullshit job or a bad job, there are plenty of people who got a lot of sense of self-worth and income from it for many years.
I mean, there's a whole school now that talks about the end of work and what do you do in a post-work society, right? And then there's, on the left, there are more calls for kind of a universal basic income because, clearly if work is not going to be as necessary to get certain things done, people are still going to need means to meet their needs, right? Where do you come out on that?
Yeah, well, I have a lot on UBI or basic income guarantee in the book because I wound up talking at length to people who are planning the pilot in Ontario and Scott Santons, who's one of these big UBI advocates. And it was interesting to me. I mean, in theory, I support it. I don't know how implementable it is, but I just practically when I saw how many of, especially these were women who would have a disabled kid or an elder that they were caring for, and they were working in this increasingly precarious middle-income jobs, I thought, wow, if they had $12,000 or $20,000 more a year, their lives would actually be rational, and that seemed like a worthy goal to me.
You've been doing a good bit of interviewing, publicity, discussion over the past time since the book came out. Is this a left-right issue?
Well, I mean, with UBI, no, right? I mean, we have Charles Murray and Y Combinator and all these libertarians supporting it. They have the World Economic Forum projecting a loss of 7 million jobs, whatever, by, I forget, is it 2020 or 2026? And 2/3 would be concentrated in advertising, public relations, and law and financial services, things that are considered middle class.
Right, the coming kind of white-collar irrelevancy, which has been more insulated until recently.
I think that libertarians and conservatives can see this on the horizon, and they have reason to wonder also about controlling for robots and about UBI and so forth.
And in conversations, I mean, have you found that is the right likely to take these realities and say X versus the left is likely to take these realities and say Y?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the right is likely to agree with these realities, but then they would definitely have a different set of fixes. Potentially UBI would be the overlap, or DIY, barter and trade, or all this kind of stuff. Yes, do it yourself, and not the bigger universal pre-K, which to me has been one of the more successful initiatives in New York, definitely, right? And that seems like it would help a lot of people in different localities around the country if that was put into practice.
And what about this question of vocational education, right? Because a lot of these, a lot of the higher education debt issue, some of the worst of it is minority communities, people in their 20s who are told they have to get X degree in order to get Y job, but then are beset by childcare costs or whatever other issues and may not even end up finishing the program, and then they're left with all the debt, none of the degree, and none of the earning power. But it's a kind of a credential tax, right? Or one could look at it as a credential tax. Do you think with more vocational education rather than funneling everybody through really expensive, time-consuming 2 to 4 year degrees?
Yeah, or shorter degrees, which I think Obama was advocating for. 2-year degrees, and not just community college, but just shorter degrees and more debt forgiveness. And I mean, we don't always have to be rushing to, get people trained for some apprenticeship for something that might become technologically outmoded relatively soon too. I mean, there could be problems I could imagine with an emphasis on vocational training. So, but what if we had more debt relief? What if I saw there was an article recently also about some employers who were enticing employees, it was in the Times, with paying some of their college debt. So maybe we need more imaginative projects like that where, you have debt forgiveness, you have, employers chipping in, you just have a different set of expectations around debt.
Do you think any country other than Scandinavian countries, which kind of remain the go-to for dealing potentially more constructively with things like healthcare, childcare, time off from work, flexible work schedules, but to be fair, these are 3 or 4 or 5 countries with less than 30 million people collectively, as opposed to the United States, which has we'll have 350 million people and a lot more variety. Do you think anyone squares this particular circle?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of the industrialized West does better than we do, right? Like, it's not just the Scandies. It's also, I mean, it's Canada, it's Germany, I don't know, France, it used to be England, right? So, I mean, when I was looking at all the maternity leaves, across nationally, and then also pregnancy leaves, it was just astonishing how bad America had it.
And when do they, I mean, I guess those nets, right, were developed gradually over the past 30 or 40 years, but certainly not just in the past 10 or 15, right?
Right. And there was a moment, right, in American history, you'll know this, when Nixon was considering helping to create a net in 1971 in order to address all the needs of working mothers, and then he vetoed it. So we almost had a foundation for this, and it was taken away, more than 40 years ago.
So at the end of your book, you do have a whole discussion of solutions and how to deal with inequality and how to deal with these issues. I mean, is inequality the issue, or is it just lack of a swath of society being able to meet their needs? Meaning, if there was more equality, it could be worse equality. Like, it could be more people not able to meet their needs. You could potentially have a lot more poor people who are struggling, and it would be more equal.
I mean, I don't think the opposite of inequality is equality. I think the opposite of inequality is justice, So I don't like equality. I think I don't know. I think equality is really problematic, right? How does that work, We're not all the same, but we can have more fairness and justice. I think this is part of why people don't like the word inequality. I've written about this. I think people like this idea of fairness and, that people get as much a share as they can, right? It's not going to necessarily be an equal share. But this is where something like a basic income guarantee would be useful, or subsidized daycare, just so people can actualize themselves, somewhat, right? And live in a fair, it's not going to be the great society, but it could be a greater society. And that's how I frame it in my mind.
That's a nice phrase. Not a great society, but a greater one, which allows for kind of a process of change rather than the reaching of an apex.
Yes, because I think it's all process, and even a practice of putting into place and piloting, say, the universal pre-K, even with flaws, or let's say somebody went right ahead and found a way to give more paid maternity leave and longer paid maternity leave, that in itself would become like a model. And I think part of what we're seeing is we're seeing some sort of new ways of unionizing that are non-traditional unions, but Atlantic wrote about this. They're kind of white-collar unions, and they include the organization I run, Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which I run with Barbara Ehrenreich. It's a journalism nonprofit, and we sort of come into the fray when DNA Info has done union busting and closed shop when the employees tried to unionize, or the Denver Post when they didn't make a 20% profit. I think they only made an 18%, like some real quite a high profit for a newspaper. And the kind of greedy owners started downsizing nonetheless. We created funds to try to give these journalists some money for their work. So there's sort of these other spaces that are starting to open up around some of these middle-class jobs. There's even like nonprofits now for adjuncts, and plenty of them actually, and nonprofits for lawyers, believe it or not. So that's, or former lawyers. So I think this is like, people are starting to realize it's a real problem. And given that unions are only something like 7% in the private sector, they used to be 30 in the 60s, like that is something that we're going to have to find alternative ways to organize around.
And do you think this is going to be most productively addressed at a national level or local? So things like universal pre-K was obviously a New York City endeavor, Seattle, and minimum wage.
I think local. I mean, the things I've been most impressed with are like Fight for 15, Emeryville, it's $15 an hour now, right, in California, or, Seattle, as you're saying, or our universal pre-K. The possibility is that we could start doing all these things locally. It could incentivize us,
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Jim and Deb Fallows have a new book out about sort of going to
Our towns, yeah. I saw that. That looks really good.
And that also is a look at a lot of creative, passionate solutions to many of these issues, but all stemming from local activism and local activity, not looking to Washington for a fix. And, whatever one feels about the current occupant of the White House, there's also, I think, some real structural questions about whether or not Washington can or certainly will, irrespective of party and who's there, be able to address a lot of these issues. And that maybe that greater society is a function of a lot of micro efforts rather than the template we grew up with, which is somebody comes into Washington and there's a big consensus and X is passed, right? A big bill that says we're going to do all these things. And, maybe that's not the future. Or maybe that shouldn't be the future. And maybe it should reside with all the energies of all the people that you look at, right? And these communities that are trying to grapple with these things, or not, as the case may be. So did any of this leave you somewhat hopeful, or did it leave you somewhat in the same place, or, where did you come out?
Well, some of it did. I mean, as I said, just the sort of nature of people's lives, that if you follow the way I report, I follow basically characters. I'm not programmatic in that way. I'll just find people or a poignant and interesting situation that seems novel to me, and I'll just follow it for years and keep following up and seeing what happened to them. And yeah, what's hopeful is that individuals do find ways of changing their lives, and they'll figure out how to get a new job, or they'll figure out how to consolidate their debt, or, they're too small to, their successes are too small for me to recommend them as solutions, but I can just say that individual will is remarkable. And I also, all the reporting I did pointed me to all these other solutions, that are within reach. And you could say they're pie in the sky, but they're things like maternity leave, better maternity leave, or pregnancy leave, or better norms around pregnancy discrimination. We have a lot of laws on the books, but I have a whole chapter where many people are being discriminated against for breastfeeding and for being pregnant on the job. And we could just start looking at how the oversight of some of the laws and the kind of norms that we've accepted. Me Too has done a great job of that, and maybe we should be moving on to things like pregnancy discrimination now. And what if we start to build awareness of that? And I saw there was a big Times article on it. I was applauding it in my mind because I was thinking, yeah, they're moving on in a good way. This is what needs to happen.
Well, I hope you'll continue to do the work that you've been doing for years of telling stories of people whose voices are otherwise invisible or not heard in a really cacophonous culture where they ought to be. And you have a really acute way of addressing these individual stories with an immense amount of empathy and compassion, which I also think is somewhat in short supply in a media and journalism and commentary culture that tends to look for the black and whites and the extremes. So I think it's great that you have been pursuing this the way you have, as diligently as you have, and also obviously the Economic Hardship Project is its own way of addressing some of the challenges that you've identified. So congrats, good luck, keep it up, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Zach. It was a pleasure to be here.